I never thought I'd be the one holding all the cards. Life has a way of coming full circle in the most unexpected ways. 3 months ago, I stood in the doorway of my father's hospital room, watching him struggle for breath. The same man who'd told me, "Your medical problems aren't my financial burden," when I was diagnosed with a rare autoimmune condition at 23. The irony wasn't lost on me. My biotech company had just patented a groundbreaking treatment for pulmonary fibrosis, the exact condition that was slowly suffocating my father. A treatment that wasn't covered by insurance yet. A treatment that would cost him everything he had, and then some. I hadn't spoken to him in 8 years, not since the day he refused to help with my medical bills and told me I was probably faking it for attention anyway. Not since I'd walked out of his house in Palo Alto with nothing but my degree and a mountain of medical debt. This is the story of how I built a medical empire from my hospital bed, how I finally confronted the man who abandoned me at my lowest point, and how I learned that revenge isn't nearly as satisfying as everyone says it is. If you've ever been betrayed by someone who was supposed to protect you, or if you've ever wondered if success really is the best revenge, stick around. This is a story about power, family, and what it truly means to heal. Hit that subscribe button if you want to hear more stories like mine. I grew up in the suburbs of Boston in what looked like the perfect American family. My father, Richard Donovan, was a respected thoracic surgeon at Massachusetts General Hospital, a fact he never let anyone forget. My mother, Elizabeth, was a high school English teacher who spent her evenings grading papers at our kitchen table. And then there was me, Abigail, or Abby, as everyone but my father called me. Our house in Newton was the envy of the neighborhood, with its pristine lawn and colonial architecture. Every Christmas, we hosted a party that half the medical staff at Mass General attended. My father would parade me around, boasting about my grades and science fair projects, as if I were another trophy on his shelf. "She's going to follow in my footsteps," he'd tell his colleagues, his hand gripping my shoulder a little too tightly. Harvard Medical School, just like her old man. What nobody saw were the Sunday dinners when he'd quiz me on human anatomy, berating me when I got something wrong. "If you can't handle this, how will you handle med school?" he'd snap, while my mother stared at her plate. I was 12. When I was 15, my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer. She fought hard for 2 years before the disease took her. I still remember her funeral at Trinity Church in Copley Square. All those doctors in black suits, shaking my father's hand, barely acknowledging the teenager standing beside him with swollen eyes. That night, after everyone left, he told me, "It's just us now, Abigail. Don't disappoint me." By some miracle, I did get into Harvard, but not for medicine. I fell in love with biochemistry instead. The microscopic ballet of proteins and enzymes fascinated me more than cutting into human bodies ever could. When I told my father I was changing my major, he didn't speak to me for a month. "You're throwing away everything I built for you," he finally said over Thanksgiving dinner at his sister's house in Providence. My cousins shifted uncomfortably in their seats as he continued. "Your mother would be disappointed." I graduated summa cum laude and secured a position at a prestigious research lab in San Francisco. My father didn't attend my graduation. "Surgeries don't reschedule themselves," he said when I called him that morning. I told myself it didn't matter. The diagnosis came during my second year in California. Strange rashes, joint pain, fatigue that left me unable to get out of bed. Test after test, specialist after specialist, until finally, a rare autoimmune disorder that was attacking my connective tissue. The treatment protocol was experimental and expensive, prohibitively so on a research assistant's salary, even with insurance. I remember sitting in my tiny Oakland apartment, calculating costs until the numbers blurred, before finally picking up the phone to call my father. It had been 6 months since we'd spoken, but I had nowhere else to turn. He listened silently as I explained my condition and the treatment costs. "That's quite unfortunate, Abigail," he said when I finished, his voice clinical and detached. "But you made your choices. Your medical problems aren't my financial burden. Perhaps if you'd chosen the career path I recommended, you'd have better connections for these situations." I tried to reason with him, my voice breaking. "Dad, I could lose the ability to walk if this progresses. The lab doesn't offer full benefits yet, and I've already maxed out my credit cards on diagnostic tests." "You've always been prone to exaggeration," he replied. "You're probably faking it for attention anyway. I have surgery in an hour. I need to prepare." That was the last conversation we had until I saw him in that hospital bed 8 years later. What he didn't know was that after I hung up the phone, something broke and reformed inside me. That night, feverish and in pain, I sketched out the concept for what would eventually become BioCure Therapeutics, a company focused on autoimmune treatment protocols that would eventually make me a millionaire before I turned 30. Sometimes I wonder if I should thank him for that final betrayal. After all, without it, I might never have discovered what I was truly capable of. I was in New York for a medical conference when I got the call from my Aunt Carol, my father's sister. "Richard's in the ICU," she said, her voice tight with worry. "It's his lungs. They're calling it idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. He's asking for you, Abby." 8 years of silence, and now he was asking for me? I almost laughed. My company had just completed Phase 3 trials for Respucure, our groundbreaking treatment for inflammatory lung conditions. The FDA fast-track approval was still pending, but the results were promising enough that we'd already started limited compassionate use programs. The timing couldn't have been more ironic. "I'll think about it," I told Carol, knowing I would go regardless. Not for him, but for myself. For closure. 2 days later, I was on a flight to Boston, scrolling through my father's medical records that Carol had sent me. The diagnosis was confirmed: aggressive pulmonary fibrosis with rapidly declining lung function. Conventional treatments weren't working. Without intervention, his prognosis was measured in months, maybe weeks. I'd imagined our reunion countless times over the years, but never like this. Never with him dependent on oxygen, his fate potentially in my hands. I had pictured confronting him at some medical gala, perhaps. Me, successful and thriving despite his abandonment, him forced to acknowledge what I'd accomplished without him. Massachusetts General Hospital hadn't changed much. The same antiseptic smell, the same hushed voices, the same squeaking shoes on linoleum. I found myself walking the familiar route to the pulmonary ward where, years ago, I'd visited my father between surgeries, bringing him coffee and listening to him talk about his cases. When I reached his room, I paused outside the door. Through the small window, I could see him, thinner, grayer, an oxygen cannula in his nose, but unmistakably still Richard Donovan. His eyes were closed, his chest rising and falling with visible effort. Carol was sitting beside him, flipping through a magazine. When she saw me, she hurried out to the hallway. "Thank God you came," she whispered, hugging me tightly. "He's been asking for you every day." "What does he want, Carol?" I asked, pulling away. She looked at me with sad eyes. "He knows about your company, Abby, about the treatment you've developed. Of course, he wasn't asking for his daughter. He was asking for the CEO of BioCure Therapeutics. His insurance won't cover experimental treatments," Carol continued, And even if it did, there's a waiting list for your compassionate use program, isn't there? He's hoping, well, you know what he's hoping. I did know. He wanted to jump the line. He wanted special treatment. He wanted me to save him. Is he even sorry? I asked, my voice barely audible. For what he did? Carol hesitated. He's complicated, Abby. You know that. I did know. I'd spent my whole life knowing. I entered the room alone. My father's eyes fluttered open as the door closed behind me. Recognition dawned slowly on his face. "Abigail," he said, his voice a rasp of its former authoritative tone. "You came." "Hello, Dad." The word felt foreign in my mouth after so many years. An awkward silence stretched between us. 8 years of unspoken words, of birthdays and holidays spent apart, of achievements uncelebrated and hardships unshared. "You look well," he finally said. "Success suits you." I didn't respond. I was searching his face for some sign of the apology I'd been waiting for since that phone call in my Oakland apartment. "Carol tells me you've seen my charts," he continued, "so you understand my situation." "I do. Your treatment, Respircure, it's showing promising results for cases like mine." "It is, but I can't access it." "Not through conventional channels." He took a labored breath. "Not in time." I remained silent, making him work for it. "I'm asking for your help, Abigail." His eyes, so like my own, held mine. "I know I have no right, but I'm asking anyway." "You're right," I said quietly. "You have no right." His jaw tightened, a familiar expression from my childhood, usually followed by a cutting remark. But his vulnerability seemed to soften him. "I was wrong," he said, each word clearly costing him. "About your condition, about not helping you." It wasn't quite an apology, but from Richard Donovan, it was close. "Do you remember what you said to me?" I asked. "That my medical problems weren't your financial burden?" He had the decency to look away. "I remember." "Why should I help you now?" "Because you're better than me," he said simply. "You always were." I felt a surge of emotions, rage, vindication, and underneath it all, a complicated love that had never fully died despite my best efforts. "I'll need to review your case in detail," I said finally. "I'll speak with your doctors." Hope flickered across his face. "Thank you, Abigail." "Don't thank me yet," I replied. "I haven't decided anything." As I turned to leave, he called my name. I paused at the door. "There's something else," he said. "A family dinner. Next Sunday at Carol's. Your cousins will be there. It would mean a lot if you came." A family dinner. As if we were normal. As if he hadn't cut me out of his life when I needed him most. "I'll think about it," I said, and left the room. In the hospital corridor, I leaned against the wall, my heart pounding. I had the power now. I could help him or walk away, just as he had done to me. The decision was mine, and we both knew it. That night, in my hotel room, I made the calls to my research team, to our compassionate use committee, to our legal department. I set things in motion, not yet sure what I would ultimately decide, but knowing I needed all the information before I made my choice. Sunday was 4 days away, 4 days to decide whether I would save the man who had left me to drown. Sunday arrived with unseasonable heat, the kind of muggy New England day that makes everyone irritable. I drove to Carol's house in Wellesley with the windows down, trying to calm my racing thoughts. The past 4 days had been a blur of hospital visits, consultations with my father's doctors, and video calls with my team in San Francisco. The verdict was clear. My father was an ideal candidate for Respircure. Without it, his prognosis was grim. With it, he had a fighting chance. I still hadn't told him my decision. Carol's colonial-style home was exactly as I remembered it. Pristine garden, American flag by the door, family photos lining the entryway. My cousin's children were playing in the backyard, their shrieks of laughter drifting through open windows. "Abby!" Carol embraced me at the door. "I'm so glad you came. Everyone's so excited to see you." Inside, the house was full of familiar faces that had aged in my absence. My cousins, Michael and Jennifer with their spouses, my Uncle Robert, and various family friends who'd known me since childhood. They greeted me with warm hugs and excited questions about my life in California, my company, my success. "We always knew you'd do amazing things," Jennifer said, squeezing my arm. "Dad keeps every article about you. He's got a whole Abby folder." I glanced at Uncle Robert, who nodded with pride. "It's true. You're making a difference in the world, kiddo." The validation felt bittersweet. Why couldn't my own father have shown this kind of support? My father arrived last, wheeled in by a home health aide. The room quieted as he entered, everyone hyper-aware of his frailty, the oxygen tank beside his wheelchair. He looked small somehow, diminished, but his eyes were alert and calculating as ever. "Abigail," he acknowledged me with a nod. "Good to see you again." Dinner was a strange affair. The conversation flowed around me, updates on children's schools, neighborhood gossip, reminiscences of past family gatherings, while I picked at Carol's pot roast, acutely aware of my father watching me from across the table. "So, Abby," Michael's wife Lisa asked during a lull, "your father tells us you might be able to help with his treatment. That must be amazing, to be able to save your own dad." The table fell silent. Carol shot Lisa a warning look. "I'm still reviewing his case," I said carefully. "It's complicated." "But surely," my father interjected, his voice stronger than it had been in the hospital, "family takes priority in these situations. Isn't that right, Abigail?" The irony was staggering. I set down my fork. "Does it, Dad? Does family take priority?" Carol tensed beside me. "Maybe we should talk about something else." "No," I said, surprising myself with my steadiness. "I think this is exactly what we should talk about. Let's talk about family priority." My father's expression hardened. "This isn't the time or place, Abigail." "Actually, I think it's perfect." I looked around the table. "Did any of you know that when I was diagnosed with an autoimmune disorder 8 years ago, I called my father for help? I was 23, my medical bills were piling up, and I was terrified." Uncomfortable glances were exchanged. Clearly, they hadn't known. "And do you know what he said?" I continued, my voice rising slightly. "He said my medical problems weren't his financial burden. He suggested I was faking it for attention. Then he hung up on me and never called back." "Abigail, that's enough," my father warned, but I was beyond stopping. "I spent 3 months in and out of hospitals. I nearly lost my job. I maxed out credit cards to pay for treatments, and not once did he check on me." "Is this true, Richard?" Uncle Robert asked, his expression troubled. My father's face flushed. "It was a complicated situation. Abigail had rejected my guidance, moved across the country. I changed my major," I exclaimed. "I chose biochemistry instead of medicine. That was my great sin. You were throwing away opportunities. I was following my passion." I was on my feet now, years of suppressed anger finally finding voice. And thank God I did, because it led me to create treatments that help thousands of people, including, potentially, you. The room was so quiet, you could hear the ice shifting in water glasses. So yes, Lisa, I said, turning to my cousin's wife, it is quite a situation. The man who abandoned me when I was sick now needs the treatment my company produces, a treatment that costs over $100,000 and isn't covered by insurance, a treatment with a waiting list hundreds of names long. My father's face had gone pale beneath his oxygen cannula. "So, what are you saying?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "You're going to deny me treatment? Revenge for what happened?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "No, Dad, I'm not like you." I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder. "Here's the paperwork to enroll you in our compassionate use program. You start treatment tomorrow." Confusion crossed his face, followed by cautious relief. Then why? Because I needed everyone here to know exactly who you are, and who I am. I'm approving your treatment not because you deserve it, but because I refuse to be the kind of person who turns their back on family. I looked around the table. Even when they've turned their back on me. The silence that followed was deafening. My father stared at the folder in front of him, his hands trembling slightly. "I'll see you at the hospital tomorrow morning," I said, gathering my purse. "The aide will know what to do with those forms." As I walked toward the door, Carol called after me, "Abby, wait!" But I was already gone, stepping out into the humid evening air, tears finally spilling down my cheeks as 8 years of pain and anger began, at last, to release its grip on my heart. The aftermath of that Sunday dinner spread through my family like wildfire. By Monday morning, my phone was flooded with messages, from Carol begging me not to leave town yet, from Uncle Robert expressing his shock and disappointment in my father, from cousins who hadn't realized what I'd been through. I ignored them all as I walked into Massachusetts General, heading straight to the pulmonary ward where my father was being prepped for his first rescue cure treatment. The paperwork had been processed with record speed, the perks of being the company founder. Dr. Lydia Chen, the pulmonologist overseeing his case, met me outside his room. "Miss Donovan," she greeted me with a firm handshake, "I can't tell you what an honor it is to meet you. Your work is revolutionizing how we approach inflammatory conditions." "Thank you," I said, uncomfortable with the praise. "How's he doing this morning?" "Anxious, but stable. We've explained the procedure." She hesitated. "He asked if you would be present during the treatment." I hadn't planned on it. "Tell him I'll stop by afterward." I spent the day at BioCure's Boston office, reviewing data and meeting with East Coast investors. It was easier to focus on work than to think about my father lying in a hospital bed, receiving the treatment that might save his life. The treatment that wouldn't exist if he hadn't abandoned me when I needed him most. When I returned to the hospital that evening, I found Carol sitting outside my father's room. "He's sleeping," she said, rising to greet me. "The doctor said the first treatment went well." I nodded, relieved despite myself. "Can we talk, Abby, please?" We walked to the hospital cafeteria, the fluorescent lighting harsh against our exhausted faces. Over bitter coffee, Carol told me what I hadn't known, how my father had fallen apart after I left, how he'd begun making mistakes at work, eventually taking early retirement when a patient complained about his bedside manner. "He kept tabs on you, you know," she said. "Every article, every press release about BioCure, he has a folder in his desk with everything you've accomplished." "That doesn't excuse what he did." "No, it doesn't," she agreed. "Nothing excuses that. But he's paid for it, Abby. He's been paying for 8 years." I wasn't ready to forgive him, but something in me softened slightly. "He never reached out, not once." "Pride," Carol said simply. The Donovan curse. We sat in silence for a moment before she added, "There's something else you should know about your mother." My heart stuttered. What about her? The cancer treatments, they were experimental. Insurance wouldn't cover them. Your father spent everything they had, remortgaged the house, worked double shifts to pay for treatments that might have saved her. Carol's eyes met mine. When they didn't work, something broke in him. I think when you got sick, it was too much like losing her all over again. I stared at my coffee, processing this revelation. It didn't justify his abandonment, but it contextualized it in a way I hadn't considered. Why didn't he tell me this? Like I said, pride. Carol reached across the table for my hand. He's not good at vulnerability. Never has been. For the next 2 weeks, I extended my stay in Boston, dividing my time between the BioCure office and the hospital. My father's condition improved gradually with each treatment, his oxygen levels stabilizing, his breathing becoming less labored. Our conversations were stilted at first, limited to medical updates and superficial pleasantries, but slowly, something began to shift between us. One afternoon, I arrived to find him sitting up in bed, a photo album open on his lap. "Your mother put this together," he said as I entered. "She was always the sentimental one." I sat beside him, looking at photographs I hadn't seen in years. My mother and father on their wedding day, me as a toddler taking my first steps, family vacations to Cape Cod. "I should have told you about her treatments," he said quietly, turning a page to reveal a photo of my mother in the hospital, smiling despite her obvious illness. "About what they cost. About what it did to me when they failed." "Yes, you should have," I agreed. I couldn't bear to watch another woman I loved suffer through experimental treatments that might not work. His voice cracked slightly. "It was cowardice, not cruelty, that made me turn away from you." It wasn't quite an apology, but from my father, it was monumental. "I was angry for a long time," I admitted. "I still am sometimes, but I also understand better now." He nodded, acknowledging the complexity of our relationship. "The irony isn't lost on me, you know, that your suffering led you to create the very thing that might save me." "Life has a way of coming full circle," I said, echoing my earlier thoughts. As my father's health improved, our relationship began a tentative healing process of its own. There were still difficult moments, old patterns that threatened to resurface, but we were both trying, perhaps for the first time. 3 weeks after that fateful Sunday dinner, I sat in Dr. Chen's office reviewing my father's latest test results. "The improvement is remarkable," she said, showing me the before and after scans of his lungs. "He's responding to the treatment better than we dared hope. So he'll recover? It's still early, but yes, I believe he will. Not to full capacity, there's permanent scarring we can't reverse, but enough to give him quality of life again." She smiled. "It's quite a gift you've given him." "It's the treatment any patient would receive," I said automatically. "Perhaps, but not every patient has a daughter who created the cure." That evening, I found my father sitting in a chair by the window, watching the sunset over Boston's skyline. His oxygen tank was still present, but the cannula was gone. He was breathing on his own for the first time in months. "Dr. Chen gave me the good news," I said, settling into the chair opposite him. "She says I have you to thank." He turned to face me, his eyes clearer than they'd been in weeks. "You have science to thank," I corrected him, "and a team of brilliant researchers. A team you built." He paused. "From your hospital bed, I'm told." I nodded, surprised he knew that detail. "I'm proud of you, Abigail," he said, the words I'd waited a lifetime to hear. "Not because you saved my life, but because of who you've become despite my failures." Tears pricked at my eyes. "Thank you. I'd like to do better," he continued, "to be a father you don't have to be ashamed of." "I was never ashamed of you," I said, truthfully. "I was hurt by you. There's a difference." "Can we start again?" he asked, vulnerability evident in his voice. "I don't deserve a second chance, but I'm asking for one anyway." I thought about the years we'd lost, the pain we'd both endured, and the unexpected path that had brought us back together. "I'd like that," I said finally, "but it won't be easy." "Nothing worth having ever is." He smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "You taught me that." 2 days later, as I prepared to return to California, I made a decision. I called our HR department and arranged for a temporary relocation to the Boston office. 6 months, enough time to oversee my father's treatment and begin the careful work of rebuilding our relationship. That evening, I visited him one last time before my flight. "I'll be back in a week," I told him, "and I'll be staying for a while." "You don't have to do that," he said, though I could see the hope in his eyes. "I know," I replied, "but family takes priority, doesn't it?" He recognized his own words, nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "yes, it does." It's been a year since that pivotal summer in Boston. My father's health has stabilized. He'll always need maintenance treatments, but he's well enough to volunteer at a patient advocacy group and even consult occasionally at Mass General. I've permanently relocated BioCure's East Coast headquarters to Boston, splitting my time between coasts. Our relationship isn't perfect. We still have moments when old wounds reopen, when conversations grow tense with unspoken history. But we're learning, both of us, how to be family again, how to forgive without forgetting, how to move forward while acknowledging the past. Sometimes the greatest triumph isn't in revenge, but in finding the strength to break destructive cycles. My father couldn't be there for me when I was sick, but that failure ultimately led me to create treatments that now help thousands of patients worldwide, including him. I don't believe everything happens for a reason. Some pain serves no purpose, but I do believe we have the power to transform our suffering into something meaningful, if we're brave enough to try. If you're struggling with family estrangement or dealing with the aftermath of betrayal, know this. Healing doesn't always look like forgiveness, and forgiveness doesn't always look like reconciliation. Your journey is your own. Trust yourself to know what you need. For those who've stayed with me through this story, thank you. If it resonated with you, consider subscribing to hear more journeys of resilience and unexpected healing. And remember that sometimes life's most profound lessons come disguised as its cruelest disappointments.